I wanted to talk to you a bit about this idea of abstract and standard time. I think you talk about it a lot as fungible time, just such a fun concept and such a useful one, I think. Can you kind of talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So fungible, I use that term and other actually.
In its proper meaning, not in its tech meaning.
Oh yeah, I know. So I realized that I couldn't say non-fungible time because it's NFT, but so fungible, fungible just means like interchangeable, right? Like currency. And so fungible time is the sense of time where like a man hour to me would be like the ultimate expression of fungible time. It's an hour is like an hour is an hour is an hour. It doesn't matter where it is, doesn't matter what order it happened in. It's exchangeable with all other hours. And even like just describing that, right? Like that sounds so unintuitive. Like that's not how we experience time, and yet it's extremely ingrained, I think, in a lot of us in terms of thinking what time is. Like if you try to tell someone that there's no such thing as minutes and hours, there's actually a lot of resistance to that, but it's like, no, minutes and hours, like that's a language and a system of measurement, and it's an agreement. It's a social agreement about these systems, but there's no natural basis for a week, for example, a 7-day week, as opposed to something like a month, like a lunar month or a solar year. So yeah, fungible time is that kind of like, I think of it often as being empty also, or it's empty and it's there to be filled with work is how I think of fungible time. There's a part where I'm talking about this amazing book called The Colonization of Time, which is about the kind of British export of a certain way of thinking about time. And it's so ironic, actually, that they would, that book talks about Australian and South African colonies specifically, but, like people showing up and not only like thinking that a modern sense of time is one that's divorced from natural cues, but also just being completely insensitive to all of the ways that the people who are living there have exquisite timing, like are extremely attuned to when things happen, and then timing one's activities in the most, in the way that makes the most sense. And so it's like the result is that they show up and they perceive timeless people. And there's this amazing quote where it's sort of, I think it's like a colonist's daughter who's like writing home to the UK and is like, we didn't have our, maybe she sent for their clocks or their watches or something, but she's like, we haven't had clocks until today, and before this we were launched into eternity. So like that kind of gives you some sense of like what they were perceiving when they looked around, which is like time, like a timeless people who not only they couldn't understand how timekeeping was done, but they also saw them as kind of not being on the historical timeline. I feel like there is these things that you sort of would intuit or you sort of know, but like obviously the phrase time is money has to do with wage labor, like one would suppose that. But when you actually like go and sort of look at the history and those moments in which something was not taken for granted, for example, there's a book by Caitlin Rosenthal called Accounting for Slavery, where she talks about the fact that some of the first documents that we would refer to as spreadsheets were on plantations to record labor of enslaved people. And that's like, I think it wasn't until I encountered that I really thought about, not only the fact that the idea of something like fungible time is historically specific, but why? Why does it exist? And if you go like even further past that, like humans have always needed ways to measure time and mark time and reckon time, like, and the system that you get at any particular time or in any particular place, it reflects just what people thought they needed to do. There isn't anything, like it is only that. And so I feel like you see in that history that there was a specific historical moment in which one group of people who, I think importantly, she mentions in that book, were often absentee plantation owners, so they were overseas, needed to count up and measure the labor days of other people as commodities. And that's how you get the kind of science of productivity tracking, and she mentions in the book that like current management science has a really uncomfortable relationship to this history. And then of course after that you have, this weird moment, at least in U.S. history, where people actually really didn't want to work for a wage. They thought they called it wage slavery. It was considered undignified, and so there's also that very specific history of like all the things that had to be done to get people to obediently show up at the factory and sell their time because they had nothing else to sell.